The history of urban warfare, from the ancient sieges of Carthage to the modern ruins of Stalingrad, is fundamentally a problem of geometry. It is a lethal contest of angles, lines of sight, and exposure. In the open field, warfare is maneuver. In the city, warfare is a series of fatal intersections. By 1943, the German Wehrmacht, an army built on the doctrine of rapid movement and sweeping encirclements, found itself trapped in a new, claustrophobic reality. The strategic initiative had been lost on the Eastern Front, and the German infantryman was no longer marching across open steppes, but fighting for survival in the shattered remains of Soviet and European cities. In this environment, the corner of a building, the edge of a window frame, or the lip of a trench became the defining boundary between life and death. To engage the enemy, a soldier had to violate the cardinal rule of survival. He had to expose himself. To see his target, he had to offer his head. To fire his weapon, he had to expose his torso to the waiting sights of Soviet snipers or the suppressing fire of submachine guns. This linear restriction of ballistics, the immutable fact that bullets travel in straight lines, was bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. The casualty rates for urban clearing operations were staggering, driven by the simple, brutal mathematics of exposure. It was within this crucible of desperation that the German High Command, OKW, began to issue demands that bordered on the realm of science fiction. They sought a technological solution to a geometrical impossibility. They demanded a weapon that could kill around corners, a device that would allow the German soldier to remain completely concealed behind cover, buried in a foxhole or hidden behind a brick wall, while delivering accurate, lethal fire against an enemy he could not physically see with his own eyes. This request challenged the foundational principles of firearms engineering. For 500 years, the development of the gun had focused on making the projectile fly straighter, faster, and flatter. Now, in the twilight of the Third Reich, engineers were asked to do the exact opposite, to bend the trajectory of a supersonic projectile by 30, 45, or even 90 degrees before it left the weapon. This requirement landed on the desks of the engineers at Rheinmetall Borsig and other armaments firms. It was not viewed as a joke, but as a critical priority. The result was the Krummlauf, curved barrel, a device that stands as the ultimate symbol of Nazi Germany's late-war philosophy. It represents the belief that superior, complex, over-engineered technology could compensate for a lack of manpower, a lack of fuel, and the crumbling strategic reality. The project was a rebellion against physics, an attempt to engineer a controlled ricochet inside a steel tube. The story of the Krummlauf is not just the story of a bent rifle. It is a forensic study of desperation, detailing how a nation known for its engineering prowess drove itself into a cul-de-sac of absurdity, creating a weapon that worked in theory but destroyed itself in practice, tearing its own steel apart in a futile attempt to bend the path of inevitable defeat. To fully appreciate the insanity of the Krummlauf project, one must first understand the host weapon upon which it was grafted, the Sturmgewehr 44, STG-44. By 1944, this rifle was the apex of infantry small arms technology. It was the world's first true assault rifle, chambered for the 7.92 33mm Kurz cartridge. This round was a masterpiece of compromise, bridging the gap between the full-power rifle cartridge, which was too heavy and recoiled too much for automatic fire, and the pistol cartridge, which lacked range. This TG-44 fired a 123-grain bullet at approximately 685 meters per second, 2,147 FTIS. It was a precision instrument designed to stabilize a spinning projectile for accurate fire out to 400 meters. The barrel of the STG-44 was rifled. Spiraled grooves cut into the steel to impart a gyroscopic spin to the bullet, ensuring its stability in flight. The engineers tasked with the Krummlauf project were asked to take this high-velocity spinning system and force it into a violent turn. The physics of this request are catastrophic. A bullet traveling at supersonic speed possesses immense kinetic energy and rotational inertia. It wants to travel in a straight line with the force of a freight train. When this projectile enters a curved barrel, two massive forces collide. The first is centrifugal force. As the bullet traverses the curve, it is pushed violently against the floor or the outer radius of the bend. This is not a gentle slide. It is a high-speed collision that lasts for milliseconds but generates incredible pressure. The second force is the conflict with the rifling. The bullet is spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. Forcing a spinning gyroscope to change its axis of movement creates a phenomenon known as gyroscopic precession, adding chaotic torque and stress to the barrel walls. The initial calculations at Rheinmetall were disheartening. They realized that simply bending a standard barrel would result in immediate catastrophic failure. The bullet would not turn. It would act like a high-speed drill bit, cutting straight through the side of the steel tube and exploding the weapon in the soldier's hands. Therefore, the Krummlauf could not be a simple modification. It had to be a specialized parasitic attachment. It had to be clamped onto the muzzle of the STG-44, a heavy extension made of the highest grade of hardened steel available to the Reich. Even with specialized alloys, the forces involved were so violent that the engineers were essentially building a disposable component. They were asking a piece of steel to contain a supersonic collision repeatedly. The friction generated by the bullet grinding against the curve generated heat spikes that threatened to soften the metal after only a few magazines. The Krummlauf was not merely a gun part. It was a physics experiment gone wrong. A device where the irresistible force of the bullet waged a war of attrition against the immovable object of the curved barrel wall. The development of the Krummlauf was not a monolithic project. It bifurcated into two distinct tactical streams, each attempting to solve a specific nightmare scenario of the late war. The first variant, designated the I version, infantry, was designed for the foot soldier fighting in the trenches and ruins. This version featured a 30-degree bend and a length of approximately 14 centimeters. The tactical concept was seductive. A soldier could remain completely submerged in a foxhole or crouched behind the thick masonry of a ruined building, exposing only the tiny, curved muzzle of his rifle to the enemy. He would aim via a periscopic sight, delivering suppressing fire without ever presenting a target to the enemy. It was the dream of the defensive war, invulnerable lethality. However, the second variant, the P version, Panzer, represented a far more radical and desperate engineering challenge. This version featured a staggering 90-degree bend. It was born from the specific terror of the dead zone surrounding German tanks. On the Eastern Front, Soviet infantry tactics had evolved to exploit the blind spots of the massive German panzers. Once Soviet soldiers swarmed close enough to a Tiger or Panther tank, within 5 to 10 meters, the tank's main gun and coaxial machine guns could not depress low enough to hit them. The tank, the ultimate predator at long range, became helpless prey at close range. Soviet infantry would climb onto the engine decks, placing magnetic mines, satchel charges, or Molotov cocktails into the vents. The P version of the Krummlauf was designed to be inserted through a dedicated port in the tank's roof or turret. From the safety of the armored interior, a crew member could sweep the entire surface of the tank with automatic fire, scrubbing the hull clean of enemy infantry like a windshield wiper. The engineering hurdles for the 90-degree P version were exponentially higher than for the 30-degree I version. Turning a bullet 90 degrees within such a short distance placed immense, almost unbearable stress on the projectile in the barrel. The friction was so intense that the barrel acted as a massive heat sink, absorbing the kinetic energy of the bullet. Early prototypes of the 90-degree barrel would glow cherry red after a single burst of automatic fire. The steel would become plastic, the rifling would strip away, and the curve would deform, rendering the weapon useless in seconds. To make the 90-degree turn viable, The engineers had to accept a trade-off that defined the entire project. The weapon would not have a service life measured in years, but in rounds. They were designing a component that was destined to fail, a desperate stopgap measure for a tank crew facing imminent death from swarming infantry. The internal ballistics of the Krummlauf reveal the project's fatal flaw, the destruction of the projectile itself. The standard German 7.92mm Kurz bullet was a complex assembly consisting of a lead core wrapped in a mild steel or copper alloy jacket. It relied on its structural integrity and aerodynamic shape to fly true and penetrate targets. However, the journey through the Krummlauf was a ballistic torture chamber. As the bullet entered the curved section, the centrifugal force slammed it against the outer wall of the bend with crushing pressure. This interaction did two catastrophic things to the projectile. First, the friction acted as a massive mechanical brake. A standard STG-44 fired a bullet at roughly 685 meters per second. A bullet exiting a 30-degree Krummlauf lost nearly 10% of that velocity. A bullet exiting the 90-degree P version lost more than 50% of its velocity, leaving the muzzle at a sluggish 300 meters per second. This drastic reduction in speed meant the bullet lost much of its energy and penetrating power. At ranges beyond 100 meters, the weapon was practically ineffective against anything but exposed flesh. Second, and more critically, the physical stress tore the bullet apart. The copper jacket, unable to withstand the grinding friction against the rifling at such extreme angles, would often rip open or strip away entirely. The lead core, softer and denser, would deform or fragment under the centrifugal load. By the time the bullet exited the muzzle of a 90-degree Krummlauf, it was often no longer a coherent projectile. It had transformed into a spray of hot lead fragments and jagged jacket shrapnel. The Nazi engineers had inadvertently reinvented the shotgun. While this fragmentation was deemed acceptable for the P version, where the goal was simply to sweep infantry off the tank hull at point-blank range, it was a disaster for the infantry version. An infantryman trying to suppress a target across a street needed a bullet that flew straight, not a cloud of metal that dispersed wildly after 20 meters. The engineers attempted to mitigate this by drilling gas relief vents into the start of the curve to bleed off pressure and reduce the violence of the impact. But this only further reduced the velocity. The Krummlauf was trapped in a physics paradox. To save the barrel, they had to slow the bullet. To make the bullet effective, they had to destroy the barrel. The challenge of the Krummlauf was not limited to the barrel. Aiming the device presented a unique optical and psychological nightmare. How does a soldier aim a weapon when the barrel is pointing 30 degrees away from his eye line? The solution developed by the German optical industry was the Zielgerät 12.1, a specially designed prismatic sight. This device clamped onto the rifle and used a system of angled mirrors and prisms to bend the soldier's line of sight to match the bend of the barrel. It allowed the shooter to look straight ahead while the rifle fired around the corner. However, the reality of using this sight in combat was disorienting and physically punishing. The recoil impulse of a standard rifle is linear. It pushes straight back into the shooter's shoulder, allowing for management and rapid follow-up shots. With the Krummlauf attached, the recoil became a complex rotational torque force. As the bullet and the expanding gases hit the curve, they pushed the muzzle sideways and up, creating a twisting motion that wrenched the weapon in the soldier's hands. Trying to track a moving target through a small, vibrating glass prism while the weapon jerked violently to the side was an ergonomic disaster. Furthermore, the periscope itself was a point of fragility. The intense vibration and the shock of firing often cracked the mirrors or misaligned the prisms, rendering the sight useless. In the dust and debris of urban combat, the small glass lenses would quickly become obscured. The psychological disconnect was perhaps the most dangerous factor. Infantry training relies on the instinctual alignment of eye, barrel, and target. The Krummlauf forced the soldier to trust a dissociated image, decoupling his vision from his physical action. In the split-second chaos of a firefight, this cognitive dissonance caused hesitation. Soldiers reported that the device felt front-heavy, awkward, and wrong. It transformed the balanced, sleek SG-44 into a clumsy, top-heavy contraption that felt more like a piece of surveying equipment than a weapon of war, alienating the very troops it was meant to protect. The durability, or the complete lack thereof, of the Krummlauf barrel became the defining technical scandal of the project, and the primary reason for its failure. The immense friction generated by the turning bullet ate through the steel with terrifying speed. The German metallurgy industry, by 1944, was already struggling with shortages of key alloying elements like tungsten, chromium, and molybdenum, which are essential for creating heat-resistant, high-strength steels. The steel available for the Krummlauf was often of inconsistent quality, unable to withstand the thermodynamic torture of the curve. The test results were damning. Early prototypes of the 90-degree P version had a service life of roughly 100 to 150 rounds. In the context of an assault rifle that cycles at 500 rounds per minute, this meant the barrel would be ruined in less than 20 seconds of sustained fire. For the 30-degree I version, the lifespan was slightly better, around 300 rounds, but still woefully inadequate for prolonged combat operations. Once the rifling in the curved section was worn down, the bullets would no longer stabilize even slightly. They would tumble immediately upon exit, keyholing through the air and losing all accuracy and lethality. Worse, as the steel wall thinned from the abrasive wear of the bullets, there was a genuine and terrifying risk of catastrophic barrel failure. If the wall became too thin, a bullet could burst through the side of the curve, sending shrapnel back towards the user or simply exploding the end of the gun. To mitigate this, the German engineers designed the Krummlauf as a quick detach system, intending for soldiers to carry multiple spare bent barrels in their kit. However, in the logistical collapse of 1945, supplying troops with standard ammunition and food was already a struggle. The idea of supplying them with disposable, high-grade steel barrel attachments was a logistical fantasy. The cost of manufacturing these precision-machined, curved, rifled tubes was high, consuming valuable manufacturing hours and resources. The Krummlauf was a single-use mentality applied to a durable good, a philosophy that ran contrary to the desperate needs of a defensive war where reliability and longevity were paramount. One of the most specific and theoretically viable applications of the Krummlauf was its proposed installation on the Panzerjäger Tiger P, commonly known as the Ferdinand or Elephant. This massive tank destroyer, weighing 65 tons, was a beast of long-range engagement, armed with a powerful 88mm gun and protected by 200mm of frontal armor. However, its debut at the Battle of Kursk in 1943 revealed a fatal, almost amateurish oversight. The vehicle lacked a hull machine gun for close-in defense. Soviet infantry quickly learned that if they could survive the long-range fire and get close enough to the Elephant, the tank was helpless. They could run up to the blind spots and disable the behemoth with satchel charges or anti-tank mines with impunity. The panic following the disaster at Kursk led to a desperate refit program. While hull machine guns were retrofitted to surviving models, the Krummlauf P was seen as the perfect supplementary solution for the remaining blind spots. The concept was that a crew member could insert the curved barrel through a loader's hatch or a specialized port and spray the hull with bullets, scratching the back of the tank to remove enemy infantry. In controlled testing, this concept worked reasonably well. The fragmentation of the bullets, the shotgun effect, was actually a benefit in this specific scenario, increasing the hit probability against infantry climbing on the vehicle's deck. However, the operational reality was clumsy and slow. Inside the cramped, smoke-filled interior of a tank destroyer in combat, trying to maneuver a full-sized STG-44 with a hot, heavy, curved attachment through a small port was difficult. By the time the crew could locate the Krummlauf, attach it, insert it into the port, and fire, the enemy infantry had likely already placed their charge. The Krummlauf was a reactive solution to a fundamental design flaw of the tank itself. A high-tech, over-engineered band-aid applied to a gaping tactical wound that should have been solved by a simple machine gun port in the initial design phase. The Krummlauf featured a specific innovation regarding gas dynamics that deserves detailed technical scrutiny, as it highlights the cat-and-mouse game the engineers played with physics. During early testing, they discovered that the gas pressure behind the bullet was actually accelerating the wear on the curve. As the bullet slowed down due to friction in the bend, the high-pressure gas behind it piled up, creating a pressure spike relative to the bullet's position. This gas hammer effect increased the heat transfer to the metal and added mechanical stress to the curve. To combat this, the engineers drilled a series of precise vent holes at the rear of the curved section, just before the bullet entered the turn. These vents allowed the high-pressure gas to escape into the atmosphere before it could hammer the bullet against the curve. This solution successfully reduced the recoil impulse and extended the barrel life marginally. However, like every aspect of the Krummlauf, it created a new, equally dangerous problem: muzzle blast. The venting gases created a massive concussive flash and noise right in front of the shooter's face, or right above the tank's roof. In the dim light of a ruined building or the confined darkness of a tank interior, this flash was blinding and deafening. It also kicked up dust, debris, and smoke, instantly obscuring the periscopic sight and revealing the shooter's position to every enemy in the vicinity. For a weapon designed for stealthy, cover-based fire, the Krummlauf was paradoxically loud and visible. The user might be hidden behind a wall, but the massive fireball erupting from the periscope level acted as a "shoot here" sign. The engineering solution to one problem, wear, created a tactical problem, visibility, that was arguably more dangerous to the operator's survival. The ergonomic failure of the Krummlauf cannot be overstated. A weapon is only as effective as the soldier wielding it, and the Krummlauf was a weapon that fought its user. The device added nearly 1.5 to 2 kilograms of weight to the very end of the rifle. This radically shifted the center of gravity forward, making the STG-44 incredibly nose-heavy. To aim it, a soldier practically had to rest the muzzle on a wall, windowsill, or trench lip. Firing it offhand, standing without support, was nearly impossible due to the leverage of the heavy steel curve. This severely limited the mobility of the soldier, tethering him to the cover he was firing from. Furthermore, the attachment clamp was a source of constant mechanical anxiety. The torque generated by the bullet turning the corner was violent enough to loosen the clamp screws. If the 90-degree barrel was not securely tightened, the torque could actually twist the entire assembly off the mount or unscrew the attachment during firing. Soldiers had to constantly check the tightness of the fit, adding another layer of maintenance to a weapon system already prone to fouling. There was also the fear of the weapon itself. German soldiers were not stupid. They could see the heat radiating from the curve, they could see the metal discoloring, and they knew the physics of a bullet hitting a wall. The fear that the device would explode in their faces was real. In the final months of the war, when morale was shattering, trusting a bizarre, overheating experimental device required a level of faith in technology that many exhausted Lancers simply did not possess. The Krummlauf was a weapon that demanded too much from the operator while delivering too little in return. The production numbers of the Krummlauf remain a subject of historical debate and illustrate the chaotic priorities of the dying Reich. Estimates suggest that roughly 20,000 units were ordered by the Heereswaffenamt, Army Weapons Agency, a staggering number for such a niche device. However, only 1,000 to 1,500 were actually delivered before the war ended. Of these, very few saw actual combat. The device was issued primarily to elite units and specialized armored divisions, but photographic evidence of the Krummlauf in actual use on the front lines is virtually non-existent. This discrepancy suggests that while the devices were distributed, troops likely discarded them. The veteran German soldier of 1945 was a ruthless pragmatist. He carried what helped him survive: ammunition, food, a reliable rifle, and discarded what slowed him down. A heavy, fragile barrel extension that ruined his primary weapon's accuracy required a delicate glass sight, and broke after a few fights was dead weight. It is highly probable that many Krummlauf units were lost in transit or abandoned in ditches by troops who preferred the reliability of a standard STG-44 or MP-40. The logistical insanity of producing the Krummlauf in 1945 is glaring. At a time when the Luftwaffe had no fuel, when tanks were being abandoned for lack of spare parts, and when the infantry lacked basic winter clothing, the German industry was expending high-grade steel and precision optical glass to build disposable bent barrels. It highlights the complete disconnect between the procurement bureaucracy in Berlin and the reality of the front. The industrial capacity used to make 500 Krummlaufs could have produced thousands of standard barrels or essential vehicle parts. The project was a resource sink that contributed nothing to the defense of the Reich, while actively consuming its dwindling industrial lifeblood. When the Allied forces, both American and Soviet, finally overran the testing grounds and factories where the Krummlauf was developed, their initial reaction was one of bewilderment. U.S. Ordnance Intelligence officers, upon recovering the strange bent rifles from the Rheinmetall facilities, initially thought they were damaged weapons or perhaps tools for testing barrel obstructions. It was only after discovering the periscopic sights, the user manuals, and the testing documentation that the true purpose became clear. The American evaluation of the Krummlauf at the Aberdeen Proving Ground was scathing. The U.S. Army, which prioritized mass production, standardization, and reliability, as seen with the M1 Garand and Sherman tank, viewed the Krummlauf as a joke, a symbol of German over-engineering gone mad. The test reports noted the rapid disintegration of the bullets, the extreme kick, the poor accuracy, and the dangerously short barrel life. They concluded that the device was unstable, inaccurate, and mechanically unsound. To the pragmatic Americans, it was inconceivable that a nation losing the war would invest resources in such a niche, fragile device. However, the Soviet response was different. The Soviets, who had suffered immensely from urban warfare in Stalingrad and Budapest, saw the potential utility in the concept. They conducted their own post-war experiments with curved barrels, most notably attempting to adapt the idea for the PPS-841 submachine gun, and later the RPD machine gun. They, too, eventually abandoned the concept for infantry use, realizing that the physics of the bullet drill could not be overcome with the materials of the time. But the fact that they investigated it shows that the tactical problem the Krummlauf tried to solve, the lethality of the corner, was recognized as a valid issue by both sides, even if the German solution was technically flawed. The Soviet fascination with the Krummlauf extended into the early Cold War. While the Americans boxed up the captured units as curiosities, Soviet engineers attempted to improve upon the design. They theorized that the flaw lay in the rifling. They experimented with smoothbore curved barrels and sabot rounds, hoping to reduce the friction that destroyed the German version. They also experimented with different curves and mounting systems for vehicle defense. Ultimately, the Soviets reached the same conclusion as the Germans. The physics were unforgiving. No matter how the barrel was constructed, the centrifugal force of a high-speed projectile turning a corner created unmanageable stress. The bullets inevitably destabilized, the barrels inevitably wore out, and the accuracy was inevitably terrible. The Soviet experiments confirmed that the Krummlauf was an engineering dead end. It was a concept that could not be perfected because it fought against the fundamental nature of ballistics. This post-war testing serves as an important validation of the German failure. It wasn't just that the Nazis built it poorly or used bad steel. It was that the idea itself was physically unsound for high-velocity projectiles. The Soviet abandonment of the project marked the final death knell for the curved barrel concept in the 20th century, relegating it to the status of a historical curiosity rather than a viable lineage of firearms development. The Krummlauf must also be understood as a psychological weapon, both for the user and the enemy. For the German High Command, it was part of the Wunderwaffe syndrome, the obsession with advanced technology as a savior. As the strategic situation collapsed, the leadership retreated into a fantasy world where magic weapons, like the V-2 rocket, the jet fighter, and the curved rifle, would turn the tide. The Krummlauf was promised to the Volkssturm, the militia of old men and boys, as a way to stay safe while killing the enemy. The logic was, if the soldier doesn't have to stick his head out to fire, he won't be as afraid, and he will fight longer. It was a morale crutch. In reality, handing a complex, jamming, barrel-eating experimental weapon to a terrified teenager in Berlin was a recipe for disaster. It likely led to more deaths due to weapon malfunction or the inability to aim effectively than it saved through cover. The weapon promised safety, but delivered a false sense of security that evaporated the moment the barrel overheated or the mirror cracked. For the Allies, had it worked, it would have been a weapon of terror. The idea that gunfire could come from impossible angles, from behind solid corners, would have slowed urban advances significantly. Soldiers are trained to identify lines of sight. If they can't see the enemy, usually, can't shoot them. The Krummlauf threatened to break this fundamental rule of cover. The psychological impact of impossible fire is profound. However, because the weapon was so rare and so ineffective, it never achieved this psychological effect on the battlefield. It remained a terror weapon only on paper. The legacy of the Krummlauf is preserved in a few rare museum pieces today. Looking at a surviving St-44 with the attachment in a museum display, one is struck by how unnatural it looks. It resembles a broken bone, a deformity grafted onto a sleek machine. The metal of the curve is often discolored, showing the blues and purples of extreme heat stress, a permanent scar of the friction it endured. Forensic analysis of these artifacts reveals the violence of the process. Inside the barrel, if one looks closely, the rifling at the curve is usually stripped smooth, obliterated by the friction of the bullets. The vent holes show signs of gas erosion. These physical scars are evidence of the limits of engineering. They demonstrate that while you can bend metal into a shape, you cannot bend the laws of motion without paying a heavy price in energy and material. The Krummlauf remains a favorite topic for military historians, not because it changed the war, it didn't, but because it perfectly encapsulates the mad scientist era of late-war Germany. It sits at the intersection of genius, the St-44, and delusion, the bent barrel. It is a reminder that innovation without practicality is useless, and that the desperation of a losing regime can produce monsters that are as dangerous to their creators as they are to the enemy. The final after-action report on the Krummlauf offers a definitive verdict. It was a tactical success in theory, but a strategic and mechanical failure in reality. The device did exactly what it was designed to do. It shot around corners. But the cost of doing so, the destruction of the bullet, the ruin of the barrel, the clumsiness of the handling, and the industrial waste, made it an ineffective weapon of war. It solved the problem of exposure, but introduced the fatal problems of inaccuracy, unreliability, and short service life. The Krummlauf was a weapon that killed its own barrel to fire a shot. It represents the ultimate dead end of mechanical firearms engineering, proving that to shoot around corners effectively, one needs to separate the gun from the shooter, as in modern remote weapon stations using cameras, not bend the gun itself. The Nazi engineers fought physics, and physics won. The Krummlauf stands as a 1.5 kilogram steel monument to the futility of trying to cheat ballistics with brute force. It remains the weirdest, most fascinating failure of the German armory. A gun that looked like a cartoon prop but killed its operator's hopes just as surely as it shattered the bullets it fired. The ultimate lesson of the Krummlauf is that in war, simplicity and reliability are the true virtues. Complexity, no matter how clever, is often just another way to fail.